Hi, thank you. Thanks. Good to see everybody. Good evening. And I'll give a second welcome to everybody. Um, Let me just start by saying that when Nat invited me to offer some prefatory remarks here about his book, I didn't hesitate. Somewhat selfishly, I should say, because the opportunity I thought would afford me a legitimate professional excuse to actually ignore my papers and take an overdue dip back into one of my, and I'll just say it, my beloved areas of inquiry here, film studies and the aesthetics of cinema. I was reflecting on this in my own cinephilia, which Nat does such a stellar job talking about in his conclusion of his work. It's been a bit undernourished lately, partly to the due to the demands of work and life, but partly due, I think, to COVID and the moat that was erected that's kind of kept me away from the theater. Probably longer than I ever have been. Absolutely longer than I ever have been. The conveniences of home film viewing, while great, of course, they simply can't substitute, I don't think, for the experiences that can unfold in those spatial geographies, those darkened big screen dream auditoriums. The spaces that I kind of fell in love with the cinema back as a boy and a young adult in Dayton, Ohio. It's remarkable, I think, to note in these days of immediate delivery and gratification and how important the theater experience, at least to me, still is to kind of keep stoking my love for this particular art form. So at any rate, I was thrilled to be given the opportunity to read such an amazingly compelling and intellectually rigorous work by Nat here. I'm not going to do too much introduction. I know that Nat wants to spend some time focusing on passages in the introduction, but I'll just say that from my reading of it, I mean, he really probes with trenchant surgical precision so many well-worn assumptions and tendencies of literary and film criticism as a whole in that introduction. Many sections here. I know I only have so much time here. I wanted to give a few quotes and shout outs. Maybe I'll just do one here, but for the close reading. But if you get a chance, his diplomatically rendered accounting of the hermeneutics of suspicion is terrific. And just his essentially what Nat's trying to do is dismantle a little bit these tendencies and criticism. We see it in literature and film studies to totalize, to generalize, to want to take individual films and immediately kind of foist them into a grander narrative. And for this, the film noirs as fulfilling some kind of symptom, illustrating some symptom that needs to be diagnosed, some larger grand narrative. It was just such a pleasure that he says, we need to take these films individually. We can't flatten them. They all have dynamic landscapes and textures that need to be looked at as film. And that's just such a refreshing approach. I mean, that's what, when I finally was able to study film studies, this is what really caught my attention. It's close reading. I mean, taking what we do with literature and looking at the films to see what they can tell us in their own special and unique ways. And he just does such a tremendous job arguing these points and justifying it and taking us through not only film noir criticism itself, but this kind of more general tendencies in film studies. And I really appreciate it. This as he was, a lot of where he's going is saying this tendency to generalize, to over categorize. It's it's natural, but it doesn't always serve the best purpose of the films. So with that, I want to at least read one thing, because I know now you're going to concentrate on something. I want to just read one passage here, and what I'm going to do. So this is from his chapter on Fritz Lang, chapter what is this, 8, I think, Nat. And I just want to give you a sample of the close readings, which essentially compose most of the book here. And I'm just going to read a few sentences, and I know you won't get the entire context here, but you can tell how rigorous and acute his analyses of some of these films are. So he's looking right now at a particular scene, and he starts breaking down camera movements and shots, and he just says this. So you just kind of read it really quickly. He's saying that Lang, he's saying that he's making a kind of curious move to construct a certain sequence, and it gives you this unsettled, uncanny quality. But the way that he goes through it is just so nicely rendered here. He says, already we may begin to note a number of curious features in the way Lang has chosen to construct this very simple 3-shot sequence. Convention would lead us to expect that this character's Neil, glance off screen, and the first shot would be followed by either a direct point of view shot, or at the very least a shot that roughly approximates Neil's perspective. Instead, Lang supplies a shot utterly detached from Neil's or any other character's point of view, one whose third-person objectivity is all the more emphasized by the camera's distant, high-angle placement. Such shots, which reduce mise-en-scène to a distantly viewed geometric pattern, are by their very nature somewhat alienating and unsettling, and were for this very reason a favorite of Lang's throughout his career. See, for instance, the opening shot of M. Okay, and that's the bread and butter that he kind of teases apart these films, and it's just such a pleasure to read that, and it was just really refreshing. Nat, I'll say that to get through some of these, and a lot of these are deep cuts that I've never heard before, so I've got some films now on my list that I'm going to have to go and watch. But you've definitely inspired me to do that. Okay, and so finally, before I shoot it over here to Nat, another reason why I thought this was a real pleasure was that I got to sit down with Nat, talk to him for a bit, and find out his origin story. Some things you just don't get to do sometimes with colleagues, as the days go on. So, we find out that we're both from the Midwest. He's from Michigan, I'm from Ohio, and we have a kind of a little bit of a similar story to how we got to film studies. We both went to undergrad in our states, and at least for me, I know you went to Michigan State, Nat, but I went to the University of Dayton, and there was one course available on film studies, but that was enough. That was enough for me. It started my intuition, as Nat refers to this in his conclusion, the intuitions, to then go seek out more tuitions. And my tuitions finally came at grad school at UC Santa Barbara, where I knew there was a film studies program, but I was in literature. But I knew I could smuggle my way into the film studies department somehow, which I did. And I was able to TA several classes over the years. And I was able to shoehorn in a lot of film theory and aesthetics and Stanley Kubrick chapter in my dissertation. And I know, Nat, you also had kind of a similar experience with kind of coming into film studies sideways. And at Florida, where you did your PhD, and you found a mentor in Robert Ray, who was in the English department, and it seemed that you made this connection, and that's where this book kind of developed out of that. Which you also, I loved your conclusion, talking through that development process and how it actually changed. So at any rate, so it was just a pleasure to be able to do this and to dip into this, Nat. And I hope everybody, even if you have just a passing interest in film noir or film in general, it's a real tremendous piece of rigorous scholarship, and it's so well written too. Just trenchant. Nat, you should be teaching in the writing studies program. Oh, you are teaching in the writing studies program. Oh, because you're a real great writer. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Nat, and I don't know if I need to introduce you anymore, but I'll just pass the baton over to you.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Nick. That was a wonderful introduction. It's strange to hear yourself talked about in the third person so extensively. But yeah, you touched on a lot of stuff that I wanted to emphasize. And I'm glad you quoted some from the book too, because I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of that. I'm mostly going to be taking sort of a more zoomed out sort of view of the whole thing and try to, as much as I can, sort of fit 200 and some odd pages into 30 some minutes of talking. So, but my story, or the remarks that I have prepared here, kind of pick up immediately where Nick's introduction leaves off. So as he was saying, I did my PhD at the University of Florida under the direction of Robert Ray, who is here, which I'm glad to see, happy to see. And this began as my dissertation, and it began in a very different form than the form that it takes today. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the genesis of the book, how it came to be. As Nick noted, I teach in a writing studies program, and I think it's important always to kind of talk about the writing process. I think it provides really valuable insight. So I'm going to go over some of the background of the book, and then I'm just going to try to go through, like I said, as much as possible and summarize, some of the main arguments that I'm making, touch on the body chapters, talk about how everything kind of fits together and what I'm saying and that sort of thing. Forgive me if I continuously look away from the screen. I have the text of what I'm saying pulled up on my second screen here. I haven't quite fully figured out how to sort of smoothly present over Zoom. But so that's the reason if I keep looking away. So anyway, back to the story. So yeah, this book began as a dissertation at the University of Florida. And in its original form, it was going to be a book that was drawing on the work of the great philosopher Stanley Cavell, as well as the British film critic Andrew Clevin, as well as some other people doing related stuff, to study depictions of the ordinary and the everyday at various points in film history. In its original form, it was going to consider 4 filmmakers: Howard Hawks, the American director, the UK filmmaking team of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, the French director Jacques Tati, and Michelangelo Antonioni, the great Italian filmmaker. To get started on the writing process, I wrote a draft of the chapter on Hawks and the Big Sleep, and then immediately hit a wall. The scope of the project suddenly seemed unrealizable. I couldn't really justify why I had chosen the 4 filmmakers that I had, other than capriciousness and personal taste. And the scope of the project seemed both too narrow and far too broad. And so I sort of stalled out on the project for a number of months and decided to shift gears completely and really narrow the focus to film noir rather than attempting to pull in, a sort of global perspective and things like that. In what ended up being the completed version of the dissertation, the sort of underlying argument was that film noir as a genre or a movement or a moment in film history represented what I called a modernist or self-reflexive turn in classic Hollywood filmmaking. And I looked still at 4 films, so The Big Sleep still, and then also Richard Fleischer's The Narrow Margin, Fritz Lang's Ministry of Fear, an excerpt of the chapter on that Nick read for you all, and finally Otto Preminger's Laura. And so that was the dissertation. The process of turning it into a book actually also started while I was at UF. While there, I had the opportunity to meet John Gibbs, a professor of film studies at the University of Reading in the UK. He had came to give a lecture and lead a seminar. And I had actually previously published a version of my chapter on the Big Sleep in the journal that he and his colleague Douglas Pye edit called Movie, a Journal of Film Criticism. And while he was at UF, he informed me that he and Doug were working on a series of books on close reading in film and TV for Palgrave Macmillan, and told me that they would be interested in seeing what I had, once it was finished. Despite that invitation, I once again shelved the topic for a fairly lengthy period of time, around 2 years, because once again, I was sort of unhappy with the way it sort of fit together. I didn't really like the framing that I had settled on with the dissertation, and I needed to find a new way of sort of articulating, these various close readings together, into something approximating a unified book. Inspiration finally struck though, and so despite shelving it, I was still thinking about it quite frequently, running through different attempts at it. I wrote up 4 or 5 different book proposals and scrapped them because I didn't really like how they came together. But inspiration finally struck one day as I was rereading one of my favorite essays in film studies, this piece by the British film critic Andrew Britton, which is titled "The Philosophy of the Pigeonhole," which is a pretty scorching and very, very aggressive critique of the work of David Bordwell, the film historian from the University of Wisconsin. Kind of over-aggressive in places, but it's kind of a pleasure to read as well. But anyway, in the course of this very, very long essay and very, very long deconstruction of Bordwell's project, Britton starts talking about the role of rules and conventions in artistic creation, and he connects, the Jacobean dramatist, classic English poetry, and then talks about it in the context of Hollywood filmmaking. And what he argues is that these conventions, within these art forms or within these periods, are not just abstract sets of rules, that artists kind of like have to follow arbitrarily, but are rather what he calls enabling possibilities. And I found that phrase, really powerful and catching, so much so that I inspired the title of the book. But the full quote of what he says here, which I think is important for kind of contextualizing what I'm doing with the book, he writes, quote, "The comparison between classical English verse and classical Hollywood has, however, another rather different point. Alexander Pope's conventions were so much more constricting than Hitchcock's that they were only able to produce one Pope. And when we examine the two traditions, we are immediately struck by the infinitely greater range of formal possibilities available to the classical filmmakers and the infinitely greater number of both distinct styles and distinguished single works which the Hollywood tradition had produced." And so film noir, of course, emerged right as this Hollywood tradition, as Britton calls it, was more or less reaching its apotheosis. The first films to which the noir label was retroactively applied, movies like The Maltese Falcon, which I'll talk about, began appearing in the early 1940s. And then by 1948, you have the Supreme Court ruling in the United States v. Paramount Pictures that basically broke up the vertically integrated, major studio monopolies and totally, transformed the way movies were produced, distributed, consumed, and so on. And while the old studios kind of continued on, for a decade or so, still producing movies that sort of superficially resembled, the great works of the 30s and 40s, I think it more or less became kind of a zombie art form, and finally was kind of put out of its misery in the 60s and 70s. And so noir then, which kind of emerges at the tail end of the studio period and reaches its full flowering then, could be seen as a really privileged site, I thought, for exploring those enabling possibilities of Hollywood filmmaking that Britton talks about, because, the noir filmmakers, the people who were making these movies, were working in a totally mature art form. Something that had developed and had reached sort of the height of its expressive capabilities. And so I realized that framing the book as sort of an exploration of the way in which these individual films take advantage of those enabling possibilities in different ways, seemed sort of a good way of going about things. And so that's what I settled on, and hence the title of the book, Film Noir and the Possibilities of Hollywood. So that's the kind of background. And so what I want to do now is spend quite a bit of time, I think, talking about the introduction, where I set up kind of the broad strokes, sort of meta-critical argument of the book, which Nick did a really good job of sort of nutshelling. I want to go into a little more detail on that. And then, like I said, I'm going to go through each of the chapters, step by step, just focusing on some key examples. Again, these are very lengthy, close readings, spending 25, 30 pages on a single film. And so if you haven't seen the movies, I don't think reading at length from those chapters would be all that edifying, or if you saw them, 10, 15, or 20 years ago. And so I just want to kind of focus on some key examples, rather than prolonged sort of verbatim readings. But anyway, the introduction. So in that essay about Bordwell, one of the chief errors that Britton identifies in Bordwell's work is this idea, Bordwell's tendency of what he says to flatten out, very, very different films into this one sort of like homogenous, group style, to make every single Hollywood film an example of the classic Hollywood style with no, attention to peculiarities or, differences between them. And so in my book, I argue that a similar flattening can be observed in the discourse surrounding film noir in particular. And I show this occurring in two distinct dimensions. The first of these is what we might call the popular imaginary, or the postmodern popular imaginary. And I think it's safe to assume that most people in my generation, millennials, as they call us, people born in the 80s or the 90s, probably the way we first encountered film noir was not by watching the movies themselves, but rather through the sort of like countless pastiches, that just occur over and over and over again, in kids' TV, in cartoons, in video games, and movies and TV shows and commercials and so on. There's this whole sort of just world of noir pastiche out there that we probably encounter before the movies themselves. But what's notable, I think, about these sort of revivals of the noir spirit and all of these different contexts is how rarely they really are parodying any individual films. Rather, they're typically just recombining a sort of set of stereotypical images, probably what pops into all of your heads if I say the words film noir, things like thick clouds of cigarette smoke, Venetian blinds, high contrast lighting, fedoras and cheap suits, hard-boiled dialogue, jazz music, that sort of thing. These are, very sort of like decontextualized signifiers, right? And of course, postmodern culture's tendency, to transform the past into just such a set of decontextualized images has been much remarked upon and is certainly not unique to film noir. What I argue, however, is that this tendency with noir is not only limited to pop culture texts, but we can also see a similar phenomenon in critical and academic discourse surrounding these films as well. And this is something, again, that Nick talked about, this sort of like rush to totalize or generalize. And so in the intro, I do a very lengthy kind of diagnosis of different critics working in different time periods and different like schools of thought and so on, who are writing about noir. And in almost every single one of the works, there is this almost immediate rush to move from the individual film to some grand pronouncement about noir as a whole. What it represents, what it symptomatically expresses, what its roots are, what explains it, and so on. So you have critics in like the 50s and the early 60s writing about how it's this expression of like universal existentialist angst. You have the theorists of the 70s and the 80s working in psychoanalysis and semiotics and post-structuralism, talking about it as sort of a symptomatic expression of, the male gaze or post-war masculinity, capitalist ideology, and all of these things. But in all of these cases, regardless of school of thought, regardless of perspective, regardless of approach, regardless of time period, there's always this push to generalize and to totalize. And I have a quote here that I think is representative from a really, really interesting book from 2002 by Paula Rabinowitz, but that is, as a quote and as a piece of analysis, sort of the mirror image of what I was talking about in pop culture with the kind of decontextualized, images of film noir. And so Rabinowitz White writes, quote, there comes a moment in many film noirs when the bad girl emerges snarling with anger as she ensnares the dim-witted doomed guy. Jane Greer, dressed like a nun, turns on Robert Mitchum in the final moment of Out of the Past after she kills her gangster lover, Kirk Douglas, leaving Mitchum dead and framed for a number of murders. So too, Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity sneers at Fred McMurray when he starts getting cold feet about their plans to murder her husband. Gloria Graham laughs at Jack Palance when he slaps her face in sudden fear. Elizabeth Scott in Too Late for Tears reveals her greedy, murderous desire for the cash hurled mistakenly into their convertible and her husband drive. These scenes repeat themselves again and again, as if it is not enough that the women's morbid sexuality marks them as bad. They must also mutate into animals. The image of the woman turning into a wild beast is code for the impossible to see the moment of female orgasm. And so we see here, right, this like radical compression of these moments from this huge variety of films that if you watch are, quite different in terms of texture, in terms of narrative. The characters that are being described here are also, quite different. But it's all being sort of compressed into like this single phenomenon. And so this, again, taking nothing away from Rabinowitz or any of the other scholars that I refer to in the introduction, who I think have done valuable work, and I certainly couldn't write stuff like this. But that brings me to what I'm doing in my book, which is attempting to, if not push back on this, at least kind of call attention to what I think some of this rush to generalize, what can be lost in the process, which is, as again, Nick very astutely summarized in his introduction, sort of an awareness or appreciation of the individual film, qua film, or as a film. And so that brings us, to what I'm actually doing in the book. And so before I move into the body chapters, I want to talk sort of about what I might take to be the slogan or the motto of this book. And so if my publisher, if Palgrave Macmillan, had allowed me to use epigraphs in the book, which I wasn't able to, because I guess there's some legalities around what counts or doesn't count as fair use, and to use something as an epigraph, you apparently have to get copyright clearance on it, which you don't have to do if you use it in the body of the text. So anyway, my book doesn't have any epigraphs. But if it did, the quote from Andrew Britton that I quoted earlier would have probably been one of them. But the second would have been this remark by Wittgenstein that he's said to have given or said to have made to M.O.C. Drury in 1948, where ironically, he's actually talking about coming up with an epigraph for his own book, which I presume to have been the philosophical investigations that he was talking about. And so here's the quote as reported by Drury from Wittgenstein. He says, quote, Hegel seems to me to always be wanting to say that things that look different are really the same, whereas my interest is in showing that things which look the same are really different. I was thinking of using as a motto for my book a quotation from King Lear, quote, I'll show you differences. The remark, you'd be surprised, wouldn't be a bad motto either. And so I would argue ultimately that the noir criticism that I've been talking about here would, according to this formulation, be Hegelian in disposition or in nature, whereas what I'm trying to do is sort of follow in Wittgenstein's tracks. And so with that, that sort of wraps up the introduction and brings us to the body chapters. And I have a PowerPoint to look at that has some images in it while I'm going through those. So let me share my screen and get this set up. All right, can everyone see that? Good, all right, awesome.
Yep.
All right, great. So yeah, so the body chapters, as I said, are a series of close readings. Most of them are lengthy looks at a single film. A couple of the chapters look at small groups of films, and I'll just, like I said, go through them one by one here. And so the book as a whole is divided into 3 sections, and the first of those is what I have called the paradigmatic and the conventional. And this is looking at movies that we would very stereotypically maybe associate with film noir. And so the first of these 2 chapters, which is called Paradigm Cases, in a nod to Hitchcock's The Paradigm Case, I look at 4 films. It's the only chapter where I look at that many films, and as a chapter, it's kind of an extension of the introduction and a demonstration of this idea of showing differences between things that apparently or seemingly look the same. And so in the chapter, I look at 4, very classic movies, the type of movies that anyone writing a book on film noir probably needs to include at least some discussion of. The Maltese Falcon by John Huston, Double Indemnity from Billy Wilder, Out of the Past from Jacques Tourneur, and Fritz Lang's Scarlet Street. And I specifically in this chapter zero in on the scene in each of the films where the protagonist first encounters the femme fatale character, which each of these films has. This is a very common scene in film noirs. Very often is the moment that kind of sets off or sets the plot in motion. The inciting incident, as they say. The moment where the lead character sort of sucked into all of the intrigue of the film. But following from that Wittgenstein quote, my goal here wasn't to identify structural similarities between these scenes, but rather to show how these different filmmakers are using this very, very common, setup in very, very different ways or for very different purposes, unique to, the individual film. And so I just want to talk about 2 of them. So first is the Maltese Falcon from 1941. And so in this scene, which I have an image from here, Huston uses the scene to do 2 things. One is to very quickly establish Humphrey Bogart's star persona, a task that was necessary in this context, given the fact that this was one of the first movies that Bogart was the leading man of. Before this, he had been playing villainous thug characters for the most part in the 30s and gangster movies. And he mainly does this in this scene by contrasting Bogart's performance style with that of Jerome Cohen, who we see here, who plays Sam Spade, Bogart's character's partner in their detective agency, Miles Archer, who very soon after this scene is shot, in the sort of mystery that sets off the plot of the movie. But as we can see here, even in this like very still image, where Cohen is like mustachioed and sort of leering, slick backed hair, his performance has a lot of like big gestures to it. He's very lascivious. He's here sort of visibly and like sweatily, lusting after the Mary Astor character who plays the femme fatale who is just off screen. Bogart's performance in the scene is very cool. It's very detached. It's, got a lot of sort of irony to it. It's very modern. So this is 1941, and we have here, sort of establishing a new star, for a new decade. But what's more is not only is this doing the work of establishing Humphrey Bogart's star persona and establishing him really as a leading man here, it's also doing some thematic and narrative foreshadowing as well, with the way it's using performance styles or calling attention to performance styles. Because of course, for those of you who have seen the film, it is later revealed that Mary Astor's character, again, who's off screen here, who's come to these guys, with a case, is just lying the whole time. In the entire movie, she's telling a series of lies and assuming, a series of identities and basically putting on a performance or a series of performances, throughout the entire movie until the end. And so this scene is kind of setting up that sort of thematic dimension as well. In contrast, we have, again, the similar scene from Billy Wilder's The Double Indemnity. But here, the scene is primarily being used, I argue, to introduce a sense of kind of slippery ambiguity into the narration of the film, into the way we're sort of processing this information. And so, again, some background for people who may have not seen this movie or not seen it recently. So this is one of those movies that's film noirs that's narrated ex post facto or kind of after the fact, this time by the main character, Walter Neff, who's narrating it into a dictaphone as he's bleeding out from a gunshot. And so he takes us back to his first encounter with Phyllis Dietrichson, played by Barbara Stanwyck, who we see here, with whom he will soon hatch a plot to murder her husband in order to collect on an insurance policy. So in Neff's telling, or the way he's attempting to frame this, he sets it up as her having totally just seduced him into this plot and him being this sort of like unwilling dupe, to everything. And in his telling, this seduction begins occurring like right from the first moment that they meet. But the way the scene is shot and edited, invites us to question, this interpretation of events. Wilder throughout the scene, and I wish I could play it here and show the contrast, but he's cutting back and forth as they're talking between a long shot that's from like down on the floor. She's up here on a balcony because she's just getting in from sunbathing. And that really emphasizes like the distance between the two. And in that long shot, like her expressions are very obscure. We can't see a lot, but that's, in reality, what, Walter would have been able to see. And he cuts back and forth between that shot and these closer in looks at Stanwyck, that would have been an impossible perspective, in reality for the character who's narrating this. But it's in these close-ups that we actually see her, giving seductive gestures and things like that, and everything that would go along with Walter's saying. And so I argue that the scene is thus, right off the bat of the story, sort of emphasizing the fact that what we're seeing is being subjectively like rendered, that all of this is coming from, this guy's perspective, and as a way of reminding us that the only way we're ever going to encounter the Stanwyck character, Phyllis Dietrichson, is through Walter's retelling of these events, because she herself, the character, is already dead once the movie once the movie begins. And so this scene is setting that up, right from the outset. The rest of the chapter, like I said, I look at two more movies, two more scenes like this from Out of the Past and Scarlet Street, doing the same type of close reading. So, but yeah, that's chapter 2. And then with chapter 3, we move into the longer discussions of single films. And I'll move a little bit more quickly through these 2 remaining chapters. I dwelled a little bit on those moments just to emphasize a little bit the type of close reading that I'm doing throughout the book. And so in chapter 3, I look, which is called The Narrow Margin Convention as Deception. I look at the use of very stereotypical noir signifiers in Richard Fleischer's The Narrow Margin from the early 50s. And specifically, I examine the ways in which these devices are used to deliberately sort of deceive and mislead viewers into drawing false conclusions or incorrect conclusions about the nature of characters, where they stand, in terms of the plot and things like that. Here's just one example of many from the film. So the movie tells the story of a police detective who is tasked with escorting the wife of a mob boss on a cross-country train trip so that she can testify against the mob boss. There are hitmen out after her, so she needs an escort, on this trip. At the start of the movie, we're introduced to a woman who we and the detective character are told is the mob wife, and she's played by Marie Windsor, and we can see her here in this image. And the way she's presented is as practically a parody of like femme fatale iconography. We can see even from the still image, she has like the cigarette hanging out of her mouth. You can't really tell here, but her apartment, is totally sort of lit in chiaroscuro. There's jazz music playing, there's those thick clouds of cigarette smoke and so on. And so everything about this is like a blinking light that's telling us, this is a femme fatale, this is a mob wife, this is, a criminal, and so on and so forth. To the extent, and it seems so overdone that on a first viewing, we might groan at sort of how overdone and sort of overly conventional and trite the representation here is. And then later on, he meets on the train, a young woman, a young mother who seems like the complete opposite of this character. She's blonde rather than brunette. She's always shot in sort of daylight, bright high key lighting and things like that. And we are led to believe, right, that we have here the very classic sort of contrast between like the femme fatale and like the good woman, that a lot of the less interesting noir films kind of make use of. But we find out, however, that this woman here that we see, the apparent femme fatale, is actually a police detective who's here undercover as a decoy, and that the sort of angelic, beatific, young mother who we met on the train is the actual mob boss's wife. And so there's this inversion there. And so, what I argue is that rather than a sort of unthinking use of generic iconography and tropes, images like this that we see on the screen, are actually sort of using noir signifiers to call attention to their status like as signifiers. And that what appears to be at first a fairly lazily like conventional film noir, almost cookie cutter in the way that it's deploying these tropes and these conventions, is revealed to be something much trickier. And in the chapter, I go into much more detail about a number of other examples of exactly the same sort of deception through convention. So, all right, moving on then. Oh, and this is a picture of the good woman who turns out to be the mobster's wife. So you can see the contrast. All right, so moving on, the next three chapters are on Ministry of Fear, The Big Sleep, and Laura. All of these are in a section that I called a tourist noir, since all are by major Hollywood directors. And some of what I was doing in each chapter was showing how, the filmmakers are using the noir genre to still kind of realize their typical, preoccupations as filmmakers, common themes and stuff like that. And so chapter 4 looks at, as it says here, Fritz Lang's Ministry of Fear, which is based on a Graham Greene novel. And in the chapter, and this is the one that Nick so helpfully read an excerpt from, I analyze how the film, expresses Lang's typical sort of interest in things like conspiracy and paranoia, showing how he does this like through editing and through the way the scenes are constructed. Sort of the way he introduces, I argue, these small disruptions or dissonances into the normally smooth unfolding of continuity editing, that when you take them together, have this effect of sort of suggesting like an organizing or a controlling presence, behind the camera who's like pulling the strings, and things like that. And then this turns out to be the case in two different levels, of course. In the film itself, the protagonist, played by Ray Milland, who we see here, finds himself caught up in this very, very elaborate like Nazi plot in England for smuggling microfilm out of the country. But then, of course, at a meta level, it's Lang himself who is the one behind the camera, arranging these things, constructing these situations, and so on. And thus, I also argue that the film can be seen as a continuation of another one of Lang's most common sort of thematic interests or dominant preoccupations, which is the similarities between like the artist or filmmaker and the master criminal or criminal mastermind. A parallel that he had been drawing going all the way back to his one of his very early films, the first Dr. Mabuse movie. So that's the long chapter. Chapter 5, which is of course the essay where this whole thing started, is on Howard Hawks's The Big Sleep. In this chapter, my focus is on how the film employs very stylized, almost mannerist sort of framing and staging, as we can see in this example and another one, to really kind of like play up or emphasize that what we're watching, or the status of what we're watching, as fantasy and wish fulfillment. And this aspect of the film, I argue, is really driven home by a scene that I focus on at great length in the chapter, something I consider to be the most beguiling scene in the movie, and maybe one of the most beguiling scenes in Hollywood filmmaking, which is this weird scene in the middle of the movie where the detective Philip Marlowe, the main character, encounters this bookstore proprietress who we never get her name, played by Dorothy Malone. In the original novel, this is a very, very brief scene, but Hawks draws it out at some length. And so he walks into her bookstore, he asks her some questions. It starts raining, he decides to hang out. They get out a bottle of booze and start drinking it. She lets her hair down, and there's a very suggestive cut, that sort of implies a sort of off-screen dalliance with this character who we've never seen before and never see again. But after this, at the end of the scene, she's left here in a shot that I find really, really sort of interesting, and something that I talk about at length in the book, like gazing longingly at Bogart's character as he leaves and walks away and, re-enters the plot of the movie. And in terms of, getting back to what I was talking about, the self-reflexivity of some of these things that I'm talking about, or the self-awareness, I argue that it's more or less impossible to ignore that the window here kind of looks like a movie screen. And thus also, it's hard to ignore the kind of obvious parallels between Malone's character, Dorothy Malone's character here, and the audience watching this movie, who is similarly sort of inexorably drawn to, all of the sort of intrigue and wish fulfillment and fantasy of Hollywood filmmaking, but is still kept, very much at a distance. So that's the chapter 5. Next, I look at Laura, the film by Otto Preminger. And so in this chapter, if both the long film and the Hawks film, is focusing on the ways they, stress their own artifice, their own construction, or calling attention to the fact that they are, these totally like constructed fantasies and things like that. This film, I argue, is much more much more interested in demonstrating some commitment to aesthetic and cinematic realism. Something Preminger was known for throughout his career. This was his first film, and that's why the title of the chapter is his statement of purpose. And so it does this, or it demonstrates this, I show, not only through its use of long takes, a technique that Andre Bazin, the great film theorist and critic, famously associated with cinematic realism, the ability of the camera just to record and record and record stuff as it's happening, without the sort of necessarily the interference of an artist. It could just record objectively, in which Preminger himself throughout his career would be highly associated with this long take style of filmmaking. But it also, as a film and throughout the story, repeatedly sort of dramatizes the gap, between reality and artifice, or reality and fantasy, and consistently comes down on the side of reality as being preferable. We can see an example of that here in this image, which I think is really great, where we get both the sort of photographic actuality of the Laura character, played by Jean Tierney, there on the left, contrasted with this like highly aestheticized, portrait of her that had been painted by the film's villain, this character Waldo Lydecker, who actually is driven so mad by the fact that he can't make the real Laura conform to this like fantasy projection of her, that he resorts to murder, and stuff like that. So again, not only aesthetically is the film, am I saying, an example of this type of commitment to realism, but it's kind of dramatizing or allegorizing the stuff like within the story as well. All right, and that wraps up the tourist noir section. The last section of close readings in the film I called Noir and History. And so in these chapters, I look at how the films discussed engage with political and historical issues. So moving away a little bit from the sort of self-reflexive stuff that I've been talking about in the previous chapters. In a broad sense, I think the arguments in this chapter are probably most pointedly directed at some of the stuff that Nick was talking about in the introduction, the so-called hermeneutics of suspicion and things like that. These chapters are really designed in some ways to push back on some forms of that ideologically minded critique. Ideologically minded critique, that looks at movies as something to be decoded for, sort of unconscious ideological symptoms and that sort of thing. And so there's two chapters in this section. The first is Fred Zinnemann's Active Violence, looks at Fred Zinnemann's Active Violence and looks at the way it sort of unsettles or deconstructs the opposition between, the city as some place of like sin and violence, and the country or the suburb, as some sort of like idyllic place of moral uprightness. An opposition that many film noirs kind of turn on, but that this one sort of like, collapses, and sort of works to reveal like the darkness lying at the heart of the suburban home, which I think is embodied in this image. And then the last of the body chapters looks at these two very interesting historical noirs by Anthony Mann called Reign of Terror and The Tall Target, which are movies that are, telling these historical stories. The first is about the French Revolution and Robespierre. The second is about a foiled attempt to assassinate Abraham Lincoln before his first inauguration. And I look at how Mann kind of manages, the difficult work of telling a suspense story about something that we already know, the ending of. We know that Lincoln doesn't get shot. That we know that Robespierre is brought down, and so on. All right, I do want to start wrapping up. I think I'm running a bit long here, but I want to talk about the conclusion just very, very briefly. And so in the conclusion, I step back from these close readings of individual movies to instead reflect on sort of the method of the way these chapters had been composed and written, and namely reflecting on the fact that nearly all of them, every chapter had begun with my interest in a single moment from each film. And this approach or method, whatever you want to call it, derives from an essay by Stanley Cavell, who I mentioned at the start of this talk, called A Capra Moment, where he talks about, how his spending time with a moment from It Happened One Night, a screenshot of which is on the screen right now, really unlocked that film, for him, even after he had spent years thinking about it. And so a discussion of that Cavell essay leads to the book's concluding paragraph, where I'm talking about this role of finding, these moments that we might not quite know the meaning of, spending time with them and allowing those to kind of unlock the films as a whole, rather than rushing to these kind of broad generalities. And so I just want to read verbatim from the conclusion of the book. So quoting myself, reflecting on A Capra Moment in an interview with Andrew Clevin, Cavell offers some productive guidance for film critics. It can be the smallest detail, he avers, but if the compass needle just jogs and you walk just a bit out of the way, everything can come out fresh. One's relation to the familiar is enlivened, the hard surface is broken. As Robert Ray, my dissertation director, has pointed out, Cavell's language here, with its evocation of the experience of wandering in the wilderness with a compass, derives from Henry David Thoreau, who frequently argued for the value of getting lost. In our most trivial walks, Thoreau writes in Walden, we are constantly, though unconsciously, steering like pilots by certain well-known beacons and headlands. And if we go beyond our usual course, we will carry in our minds the bearing of some neighboring cape, and not till we are completely lost or turned around, for a man needs only to be turned around once with his eyes shut in this world to be lost, do we appreciate the vastness and strangeness of nature. And so the approach that I describe in this concluding chapter and that I practice throughout the pages of my book provides, I think, an analogous experience for the film scholar, a means of reactivating, of making new, even the most apparently well-trodden and familiar films and genres, a means, in short, of appreciating the vastness and strangeness of the cinema. And that's all I've got, so thank you.
You think by this time I'd have the unmuting down pretty pretty well, but clicked on something that came in front of it. So I think maybe for the questions, I'll switch back to gallery view. But if you prefer to change, Nathaniel, just let me know. Nathaniel or Nat will handle the questions, but I'll ask people to use the raise hand function so that it's easy for him to spot. I imagine most of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, just click on, go to the bottom, click on reactions to the far right, and the big bar on the bottom is raise hand. I'll also say, as people are thinking of questions, that it was really a delight to get some new perspectives on a few films I know very well, but also to be inspired by, to go out and maybe stream some more. It's a wonderful genre, and it is nice to think about not just the similarities, but the distinctiveness and how directors themselves played with the conventions to overturn the conventions. So questions? Yes, and you can ask in the chat as well.
Yeah, so Raphael asked a question in the chat. I'll read it out loud just so we don't all have to open it. He says, you sort of answered this question in the conclusion, but I'll ask you to say more if it's all right. I'm sympathetic to your push to return to close reading, but given that you don't necessarily eschew generalizing altogether, I'm wondering if I might ask you to do one more generalization. Is there anything about the grand scope of film noir, of its character as a totalized body of work, that calls for this return to close reading? I guess what I mean is the critical attitude that you're applying to film noir, or that one that film noir itself seems to call for. That's a great question, and it's something I do touch on a little bit in the extended version of the conclusion. But so in the introduction, I talk about at great length, what I touched on a little bit about how noir has been particularly subject to these sorts of like hermeneutics of suspicion, interpretations, has been particularly subjected to, these grand sort of theorizations of what it all means and so on. And there's also kind of like a flip side of that in some corners of film studies as well, that have made the argument that film noir doesn't actually exist because no one can actually find a single like unifying like principle to it, because it wasn't really thought of by the filmmakers themselves as a genre in the way, say, the Western was, but that's a whole other debate. But I think because of that, because we know all this stuff, because of the way it's filtered into like the popular imaginary, because there are all these sort of theorizations of the femme fatale, of what it all means, of its relationship to things like post-war masculinity and so on, it can be very easy to, when you see a movie, to kind of instantly like just fall back on that explanation, because there have been so many of those explanations, and because they're fairly well known, especially for explanations of from film theory and stuff like that. I think they gain kind of a wider purchase maybe than in other genres or historical periods. And so because of the prevalence of those sort of like standard or built-in readings, I found it to be a particularly like valuable, thing to return to without trying to sort of clear all that stuff away, get out of those sort of like habituated readings or habituated responses that Thoreau is kind of talking about in that quote that I added at the end. So I hope that's kind of why I think noir particularly calls for this sort of thing. I hope that answered the question. Hugh, I see that you have the hand up.
Yeah, so I was actually inspired by one of your comments, which was that they didn't think of it as a genre. Did they think of themselves in terms of genre at all? So in some cases, hard-boiled detective, or in some cases, mystery, or is the whole idea of genre something that we impose in retrospect?
Yeah, and there's a lot of debate over this. I mean, obviously, many of these films are operating within distinct genres, like the detective film, or like the melodrama, the crime melodrama, and stuff like that. And those things, I think, were at the time, sensed as genres, or the hard-boiled, I think was sensed at the time or understood at the time as a genre. The term noir itself, which really yokes together not only detective films, but also, a wide range of other things that have some of the features in common with those, detective films, was invented after the fact. It was a coinage of French critics, in the 1950s, who were seeing these American movies, and, themselves. So it was from the start sort of this generalization, right? They saw all these movies that, shared various types of similarities, and they, called it film noir. And then that, entered into the sort of like critical discourse. And so because of that, other people have sort of reverse engineered this and said, we shouldn't call this a genre because it didn't really function the same way, that the Western did or the musical did, or, pick a genre did. And so in the book, I'm very sort of careful about, what I refer to it as. It's sometimes called a cycle of films, or a historical moment or a style. And there are huge debates over what it was or wasn't, or if it was anything. But my own sort of perspective on it, and this also comes from Wittgenstein, is that he talks somewhere, I think, in the philosophical investigations about what a game is. And he says, if you ask someone for a definition of what a game is, it would be nearly impossible to, name a single definition that somehow encompasses everything that we call like games. Instead, he talks about how everything that we call a game, that there are a set of family resemblances between them. And so even if there isn't, one single characteristic that we can point to that's shared among every single, item in the category, it's a series of family resemblances. And I think that's probably the most useful way of thinking about noir as a collection of films. Genre is kind of a shorthand like that, but it gets more complicated when you sort of peer into it.
I think I just firmly demonstrated that I'm not a film specialist. But we are getting close to 9, but I think we often go a ways over. Obviously, if anybody has anything coming up at 9, you can feel free to slip away, but we will stay on for some more questions. I see Christina has one.
Yeah, that's okay. Is it fair game?
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see the hand.
No, that's all right.
Sorry.
So you mentioned detective, and that's of course like a trope within noir film. I was thinking about your approach, like your methodology of sort of almost taking a snapshot from each of these films and really diving deep into those sort of decisive moments of what the film is about. So I'm just curious about your own detective work in close reading of those scenes. And so, like, are there certain things that you sort of dive into first, gesture, narrative, lighting, or do the scenes do you take different approaches per scene? So I'm just curious about your working process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm glad to hear the comparison to like investigation. Again, I'm always interested in these sort of like meta or self-reflexive things. And so, thinking of my own work as, an example of that sort of investigation is useful, I think. In terms of like method, I don't think I can, give a concise, sort of step-by-step process or set of instructions here for what I'm doing. Like I said, for the most part, these began with, these moments that sort of like pricked some like curiosity, but that I didn't have like an explanation for. And I just sort of like slowly unpacked it, through associations with other movies, through looking at, other scenes in the same film that, maybe existed in sort of like counterpoint with that moment or explained what made that, stand out in particular. Like the genesis of the Laura chapter on realism, for instance, it came from a scene that I didn't talk about here because I would have to get into way too much to talk about it in the talk. But there's a very, very brief scene that depicts the Laura character like making a cup of coffee. And it's one of those things that, seems kind of incidental, maybe needs to be there, doesn't necessarily need to be there, isn't fully moving the plot along, in any obvious way, but it really like caught my attention. And I began thinking about it, in comparison with this very, very famous scene from Italian neo-realism from the film Umberto D, in which this young maid character makes a cup of coffee. And this is a scene that Andre Bazin talks about at length as like a key example of neo-realism or realism in filmmaking. It's totally unadorned. It takes us through like every step of the process of like getting the beans out and grinding them and pouring the water and stuff like that. There's no narrative happening. It's purely just this sort of like depiction of ordinary life. And the scene in Laura is obviously nowhere near that. It's still a Hollywood movie. But thinking about the sort of coincidence or the rhyme between those two moments got me, kind of got the wheels turning, thinking about the role of realism in Preminger's work, as a whole, and reading that, which is often discussed in the context of his later films, and reading that back onto Laura, this early film. And then from there, it just kind of like, the wheels start turning and stuff spirals and more connections are brought in and stuff like that. But that's really how it starts, is just, some scene, some moment, that catches your attention and that you just sit with and kind of dwell on, and try to sort of like, work through and unpack.
All right, thank you for that.
Any other questions?
Well, Nat, I'm just going to ask you once, kind of piggybacking off of what Christine was asking about, how do you come to your methods or these Capra moments, as you so eloquently put it, and start to dive down. But I'm just interested, when did you start watching film noir? Do you recall? Were you young? Were you?
I mean, I think as I said in the talk, like I first encountered this stuff through stuff like the Tiny Toon Adventures or Animaniacs or those Warner Brothers cartoons that I watched as a little kid,
Right.
Or through parodies on The Simpsons and stuff like that. But I think I saw the Maltese Falcon, I think when I was in high school. That was the first of the actual film noirs that I watched, and I developed kind of an instant like interest in the genre, or whatever we want to call it. And it's been one of the things that I've been most interested in about movies, since I started watching them seriously in high school. I mean, as I said, I never intended to write my dissertation, on noir. That just kind of happened through happenstance. But it is something, a set of films that I've always been pretty interested in and enjoyed enjoyed watching.
Were any of these new to you? Like, did you watch this the first time?
Yeah, a couple. Act of Violence I hadn't seen before I sat down and started working on this. I'd seen other movies by Zinneman. The historical ones, the ones that I talked about in the last chapter by Anthony Mann. Again, I had seen other Anthony Mann movies, but I didn't actually watch Reign of Terror or The Tall Target until I started working on the project. They seemed like they would fit with that section on politics and history, so I sought those out then. The others I had seen before I started working on the dissertation.
Thanks. I know Brian's got a question, so
Yeah.
I'll let you go. But I do want to say you should. I think you should have a sequel, and you should do the like neo noir now. So you got Mulholland Drive and Chinatown, and tackle those. Same thing.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, Brian, though, I see you got your hand up.
Thank you very much for this introduction to your book, Nat. I'm curious how your close reading skills and your study of genre have made their way into the way that you teach. Are you able to use noir as a lens or as a motif for your classes? Are you able to bring your own scholarly interests into the work that you do in teaching writing?
Unfortunately, I have not yet found a way to bring film noir into tech writing classes and things like that. But I do think that kind of awareness of like genre conventions does influence the way I teach writing, whether it's academic writing, whether it's writing in the humanities, or whether it is, writing in the sciences like I'm doing this semester. In all those classes, I'm talking a lot about understanding genre, understanding context, understanding that, there are these rules, but it's up to you as the writer to kind of, use them properly, or use them to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, that it's not just, a set of instructions to follow, but, what Britton calls sort of enabling possibilities. And I think that's, obviously true of artistic creation, but I think true of other types of writing or expression as well. Yeah, Barbara.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was gonna ask. Okay, I was gonna ask this question, and I changed my mind, and I'm gonna ask it again. So do you think? Okay, so I had like the original question, then I have a layer over it. Like, do you think there's a big difference in your analysis of any of these between the films that were based on books and those that were not based on books? But then also something I find interesting layered on top of that is the fact that so many of the directors, you're talking about realism in the films, that so many of the directors are Jewish. So I don't know if you've thought about that at all, but like we have these films that have these like traditional, like these tough guy kind of femme that are like dark and gritty. And do you think the realism is affected at all by the time period and the fact that directors are Jewish? So I don't know if they're different questions, but I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, no, very, very good questions. In terms of the book stuff, I haven't thought at great length about that, about the differences between the ones that are adapted from books and the ones that aren't. Of the ones where I've read the book, in almost all cases, the movies are very, very different. Hawks takes Raymond Chandler's, The Big Sleep and turns it into a Howard Hawks movie. The Laura book is not very good. It's just kind of, generic pulp fiction. And the Ministry of Fear is probably closest to the book, but it takes out a lot. It's much less serious, even though it's directed by Fritz Lang. It's actually much less serious than the Graham Greene book is. But yeah, I haven't really thought about how being adapted sort of impacts or influences or makes them different from the others. Because I think they're all still very cinematic in the way they're sort of working. As for the second question, I hadn't thought specifically about the connection between, Judaism and realism, or Jewishness and realism. But I think it is, a fact that a lot of what became the noir like stylistics, the high contrast lighting, the sort of like very expressionistic, imagery and stuff like that, along with a lot of the people who directed, noir films or starred in them, were refugees from Germany, people who had fled Germany, when Hitler came to power, including Fritz Lang, and had brought with them that like German expressionism from the silent period, to Hollywood, where it, a lot of it sort of got metabolized and started showing up, all through the 30s, but really started showing up in film noir. So I think there is certainly something to that connection. It's not something I thought about in any sort of real extensive length, though.
I taught the Maltese Falcon when I taught high school. I talked to my high school students. They were horrified that Humphrey Bogart was playing the main character. They did not picture Humphrey Bogart at all. They thought he was like sallow and ugly. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, which I mean is why the movie has to do a lot of work to kind of make you see him as a leading man, but I guess it worked.
Well, unless there's any more questions, and I think we only have time for maybe one more. But I'll just wait. Okay, if there's not any more, I'd very much like to appreciate, to state my appreciation. It's been a long week and it's only Wednesday night. One advantage of doing the regular meeting rather than a webinar is we can do things like this. Or just applaud like this. So I think we can all express our appreciation for a really interesting talk, and thanks for sharing your work with us.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks Hugh for inviting me to be part of this really great series.
Okay. So with that, thanks everybody for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. And for those of you who are at UM, look forward to spring break.